Imagine walking into school every day knowing you'll be misunderstood, not because you can't learn, but because the system wasn't built for the way you think. Today, we're going to discuss how to move past token inclusion and reimagine schools where neurodivergent students are not just accepted, they're celebrated. Welcome to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning. I'm your host, Dr. Karen Wilson. My guest today, Amanda Morin, is a neurodivergent educator and a nationally recognized advocate for inclusion education. Amanda is the author of 5 books, and in her new book, Neurodiversity-Affirming Schools, she discusses how to build classrooms that truly affirm neurodivergent students. And today, we're unpacking the double empathy problem, the difference between neurodivergent and neurodivergence, why language matters, and how educators can create safe, strength-based classrooms starting right now. Let's get started.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social-emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Amanda, welcome.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
I'm so glad you're here. I'm actually very honored to have you here. I've been trying to get you here for a long time, and I'm so glad it finally happened.
Me too. Well, I'm honored too. I think, I always enjoy your perspective on all of the things, and I'm super excited. We haven't had a conversation in a long time, right?
In a long time. I mean, I think we started working together. I knew of you because of Understood, because I'm one of the experts for Understood, and you were like one of the people who actually was there when Understood was created, as I understand.
I helped build and launch it and then stayed on. I was their director of thought leadership and expertise for quite some time. So we go back. That's a long time now.
That's a long time, yes. And I wanted to talk to you because, for a number of different topics, but your most recent book was one of the reasons why I said, okay, I have to reach out and have you on now, especially because we're recording this in the summer. The new school year is about to begin. And I think your book sets the perfect tone for, school all year round. But as I'm thinking about going into a new school year, I think it's particularly important and to be thinking about this.
Yeah, I think one of the things about summertime, when we think about, teachers and going back to the classroom, when everyone thinks summertime is a time off, it's totally not. Like, we're always thinking about it. But what I love is it's a time for a reset. It gives people time to sort of rethink, how did last year go? What do I want to do differently in the fall? How can I improve? How can I really engage my students in new ways? Yeah. And I think the book is helpful for that, for sure.
Yes, because one of the things you talk about is that inclusion, when we think about a school environment, isn't something that we should have to make a case for, right?
Totally. Well, and I think one of the things, the reason I use Neurodiversity-Affirming, and Emily Kircher Morris co-authored this book with me, and Emily's fantastic. We had, it's a challenging book to write, to be honest, right? Because it's like new thought processes. One of the reasons we're looking at neurodiversity-affirming is because we thought the word inclusion didn't actually capture what we're trying to do. That sense of belonging, that sense of everybody has a place. Inclusion has this implication that somebody gets to just decide, right? So you can't have inclusion without exclusion as a concept, I think inclusion is much better than where we were many years ago. I think everybody has the best of intentions. So anyone who's doing inclusive work, I also consider myself in that space. I'm just hoping to challenge people to think a little bit beyond that, right? Where are we in a place where everybody belongs without having to think about whether or not they should belong?
And inclusion can mean so many different things to different people.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that's important too. And I'd love for you to share, maybe that's where we can start, with what a truly neurodiversity affirming school looks like in practice, how it feels different from a school that's just checking the inclusion box. How about we start there?
Sure. I mean, the funny thing is when I talk to teachers or even parents, right? When I'm talking to people who are thinking about neurodiversity affirming schools, the first word that comes to mind is chaotic in the best possible way, right? Because I think we think about schools and learning in a very sort of structured way, right? We think about sort of everybody sitting in their seats and everybody walking in the lines and all of these kinds of things. So we think about this very structured kind of environment. When we think about moving to a more neurodiversity affirming, it means letting go of some of that control, some of that rigidity, right? And so to some people, I think that looks like chaos. I think of it as controlled chaos though, right? It's not chaotic. What it's doing is there's these environments where you're building in space for students to learn how they need to learn, move when they need to move, ask for help when they need to ask for help without feeling like they're putting somebody out or without feeling like they're going to be the only one who's going to ask for help. And it's a matter of really thinking through what, as a teacher, do I find really valuable in teaching, right? So is it that everybody's sitting in their seats and paying attention the way I think paying attention looks? Or is it them engaged in learning because they're motivated, they feel comfortable, they're available to attend to it because they're not worried about all the other things that make them feel or look different or those kinds of things? I think that's a starting point.
Yes. And I think that when you have that approach, and maybe educators don't think about it this way, but that approach benefits all students, not just those with identified differences.
Right. And I think that's the point of neurodiversity affirming as opposed to neurodivergent affirming, right? Because neurodiversity is everybody, right? Neurodiverse is the entire system of people. Neurodivergent is, and I'm not telling you anything you don't know. Neurodivergent is when the way that somebody's brain is interacting with the world may make it a little bit more difficult for them to get on in the world or to interact with the world or to do things in the way that they would like to. So the point is to make sure that we're really embracing all the minds that are in our classrooms and making sure that everybody has access in the way that they need access. So it definitely helps everybody to rethink. And I want to be clear in saying it's a paradigm shift, right? It's a paradigm shift, and it could be scary to think like I'm going to do all the things all at once. But it doesn't have to be everything all at once, right? It can be as simple as thinking through, how do I set up my classroom in a way that's less visually cluttered, for example? Or how do I build in spaces where students can work by themselves or in groups or can pace if that's the way they think better, right? So it's not everything that you have to change. And I think it's so important. I mean, as a teacher myself, I would not know how to even begin changing everything in my classroom at the same time.
Right. And it may be unrealistic to think that.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? And that's where you get the chaos because it feels like you're doing all the things all at once.
Exactly. And so, when I have conversations with teachers, I often say to them, pick the most important thing, right? What is the thing that's going to make you feel the most accomplished, the most effective, right? And for some, it's about behavior management and rethinking how they look at behavior. For some, it's rethinking their classroom space. For some, it's really rethinking how they plan their lessons and how they're explicit about explaining to students what the goal of the lesson is. But there's so many different things that you can tackle. And then once you feel like you've tackled that one thing and done it well, it makes it easier to think through, what do I do next, right?
Right. I want to back up to something that you kind of differentiated between. And in your book, you're very intentional about distinguishing between neurodivergent and neurodivergence. And as someone who values precise affirming language, I know that it's not just semantics. It really shapes perception. So I'd love for you to kind of talk about that a little bit more for people who may not make that distinction.
Well, I think the best way to look at this, right, is I tend to tell this story, and it's going to get there. It's just going to be a little bit around and about.
That's okay. We've got time.
We took a family vacation at one point to the Dominican Republic, and there was this bird on walking past us, and it looked like a chicken, and it quacked like a duck, and it moved like a duck, but it was on the ground, and then it went into the water. And my family's from New England, right? We're now in California. We live in California now, but we're from New England. And my son was like, "What is that? I don't understand what this is." And so we did a little research, and it was a duck. It was a duck. It looked different than we had been used to, but it had adapted to the environment in which it lived, right? But it doesn't mean it wasn't a duck, right? So when we think about nature, there's biodiversity, right? The duck had adapted to the environment it was in, and it looked different, but it was still a duck, right? There are all these different things in nature that are diverse, right? So, and some thrive in one environment better than they do in another environment. Neurodiverse is the same thing, right? There are all kinds of minds in the world, and all of those kinds of minds interact differently. And together, that's neurodiverse, right? Because there's no one pathway. Neurodivergent is that place where I start thinking about where somebody's way they interact socially, academically, functionally, so for example, I am neurodivergent. I have significant sensory issues. So there are places where I don't feel functional. Airports is a really good example of that. The lights, the noise, things like that. I don't feel like I can be my best self, and I'm not. I mean, through and through not. And that's because the way my brain is wired makes it difficult to interact with the environment and continue to be functional in the way I need to be to show up and be productive, right? And that's neurodivergence. It's to some degree environmentally interactive, right? So, and I think this is a conversation a lot of people have around what's the social model of disability. The reason and Emily and I did this very intentionally, distinguish between neurodiverse and neurodivergent, is because everybody's minds need something different to be productive. Neurodivergent minds may need additional support to get past the barriers that are put in front of them by the environment they're in. And to be really clear, I am at my home right now having this conversation with you. I am fine. I can control the lights. I can control the temperature. I can control all of the sensory components of things so I can be my most productive self. I can't control that in an airport. I'm still neurodivergent wherever I am, but I function better in a place where there are things that I can make accommodations and adjustments to. And so when we think about neurodiversity-affirming environments, we're thinking about how do you put into place the adjustments that all minds need to be productive, but designing for the margins of the students who may need more accommodation to be productive.
Right. And I think that's where the challenge comes in. And I think that you've described that so beautifully that it's really going to be helpful for people to understand that distinction, and know that it's not just semantics, because there really is purpose behind that. We know that stigma is a powerful barrier. You talked about barrier, in environment, but stigma is also an important barrier. Studies show that when children internalize stigma, it impacts not just their mental health, but also their academic persistence and their ability to self-advocate. Have you thought about, and I know you have, but people listening, what are some impactful ways that schools and educators can actively work to destigmatize neurodivergence beyond just awareness campaigns? You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah. It's funny. All of my children are neurodivergent. I have two sons who are autistic, and that's their identity first language kiddos. And one of them is the kid who will go into the classroom and say, "You're aware that I'm here already. Like, we don't need an awareness campaign. I'm here. I'm aware. You're aware." Right? Which is kind of funny because he's been raised by me, so that he has that ability to do that. I think one of the things that is really important for schools is to really name what you're seeing, right? I think we do a lot of euphemistic conversation. We talk about kids who are quirky or they're a little outside the box, or but we should, I really believe in naming what we see, especially for the students, right? So if a student has dyslexia, I think we should talk about dyslexia, not, if that's the specific identification or diagnosis they have. In part because they're going to give themselves labels if we don't give them those words. They're going to think, I'm dumb, I'm lazy, I don't try hard enough, like all of those things, right? But if we give them the words to say, this is why you're struggling, this is, and here's like, if you want to see the research and you want to see what an fMRI looks like on a brain of a student with dyslexia, I can show you that this is real, right? So I think the first thing is to name what we see, right? Like to actually just be intentional and say, there's nothing wrong with this. You have a student with autism or an autistic student, however you talk about that, that's just truth, right? It's not, there's no moral judgment in that. And I think that's the second piece is I think we need to stop assuming there's moral judgment around all of this stuff, right? There's no good or bad. It just is. It just is. And that's asking a lot of people, but it's actually a small step, instead of saying this, and I think there's value in people using phrases like learning differences. I think there's value in it, especially when it's a self-identified phrase. But when we say, this child has learning differences, difference from who is always my question, right? And saying this child has a language-based learning disability, or this child has dyslexia, or this child has ADHD, gives us a starting point to actually put words to it, to do some perhaps research, and to ask that child, what does this feel like for you, right? Because I think one of the other things that we need to do is start bringing kids into the conversation sooner. I think we make a lot of assumptions about what will work for kids without asking them what's going to work for you or what is working for you. Yeah.
Yes. And I think that is such an important point that you made about, one, letting kids know about their diagnosis, if they have a diagnosis, know what it is that is getting in their way and naming it dyslexia or dyscalculia. So many students say, I'm just not a math person when, well, yes, you are.
Right.
Dyscalculia, which is, X, Y, and Z, and we can describe that. It is so important because, like you said, students form their own narrative. And I can't tell you how many parents, I've worked with hundreds of parents. How many parents have come through the office and don't want to tell their kids what the issue is, what the struggle is, because they don't want to label them, and they don't want their kids to stop trying or use their diagnosis as an excuse. And there's been, we have to go through a lot of working through where that comes from. Because again, kids will form their own narrative. They will attribute their difficulties to their own perception of what's going on. And like you said, it's laziness. I'm not trying hard enough, or I'm just not smart, or I'm not good at school, or I'm just not a people person, or people just don't like me. And so we want to avoid them making those conclusions that are incorrect.
Yeah. And I think too, there's this piece of it too, where when we hear kids doing that, the ability to challenge that and ask them, why do you think that? Or tell me what makes you feel like you're not a people person, or those kinds of things. And they may not be a people person. And that's okay. But to be able to say, I need time by myself to recharge and regain energy because, and filling in the end, because my brain is overwhelmed, because my social battery is low, because whatever that because is, we need to help them figure out the because when we leave that narrative at just, I'm not, we're not giving them anything to move with. And, I have said plenty of times I'm not a people person, which is silly because a lot of times I am a people person, but sometimes I'm not. But I can also say, today I'm not a people person because I'm peopled out, because I'm tired and I've had so many conversations that my brain feels really like it can't hold any more information that needs to process through what's going on. I think we need to give kids that language too. I think we need to give teachers and parents that language too, right?
Yes. Yes.
I think we just need to give humans that language.
We absolutely do. One of the very thought-provoking concepts you explore in your book is the double empathy problem. Many people, for example, with social challenges, related to autism or other neurodivergences, are sometimes perceived as deficits in social skills, but research is really telling a different story. For listeners who may be new to the idea of double empathy, what does it mean for how we understand and respond to students?
So, and I'll go a little nerdy and say, if anyone wants to look it up in depth, that's Damian Milton's work, and it's fantastic. The double empathy problem talks about how do we communicate with each other, right? And so, in a really basic way, what we're talking about is there are difficulties in understanding and getting, communicative channels open sometimes, right? And a lot of times, what happens is we say, the neurodivergent person needs to change the way that they communicate so that they can be more easily understood, or they can show up in a way that other people can make sense of it. The double empathy problem says, wait a minute, hold up. Actually, there's a two-way street here, right? And perhaps it's not all the responsibility of the neurodivergent person to change the way they communicate. Perhaps some of that responsibility lies on and the word that I tend to use is neuronormative, right? And I don't love neurotypical because I don't love the word typical. Perhaps the responsibility is mutual, right? Maybe we need to make an effort to understand the communication style and what is happening when there's a breakdown of communication so that both parties have a way of coming to an understanding. And being able to say, like, we have to meet each other halfway. We have to try and understand each other halfway. It's a joke in my house, and actually everyone I've always worked with, I narrate my facial expressions. Because, and I think it's because I've raised autistic kids, I just kind of tend to do it. But, you'll hear me in meetings say, this is my thinking face, because I don't want anyone to assume they're seeing anger or they're seeing something they're not. And that's my attempt in some ways to bridge that double empathy problem. I'm giving people cues to understand what I'm doing so they don't have to make assumptions or ask or feel like they can't do, because there are all of these ways that you read communication that is not easy for some people. And we assume that they'll just pick it up or they need to. But sometimes it's as simple as saying, this is my thinking face, right? Or as simple as saying, it's okay to ask me if you don't understand what my tone was, or it's okay, those kinds of things. And so that's the double empathy problem. There's a wonderful set of cartoons and things. It's M. Hammond, who goes by Neurowild on all of her channels. M. Hammond, I am enthralled with the way she describes this. She has this comic strip about squirrels and beavers that talks about the double empathy problem. It's beautiful. I use it in presentations. I have paid to use it because I want to make sure that I'm crediting people's work, right? And then there's also a book that I use with both students and teachers called The Cow That Went Oink by Bernard Most. And it's all about farmyard communication and a cow and a pig who learn to speak each other's language so that they can communicate. It's a beautiful story that actually I was like, wow, this is the double empathy problem. I just thought it was fun, and then I started reading it and I talk about it. So one of the presentations I do is it's called When Cows Go Oink, a shared understanding of communication and language.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like, the example that you gave about kind of describing what it is that you're feeling and what it is your face is saying, basically to other people, is something that can be modeled. The teachers can model in the classroom and help. I think that would actually decrease the stress and anxiety for so many students who may have difficulties with perceiving social cues.
I absolutely agree. There's another, and I'll give it just another because I think people always need those kind of concrete things, right? There's another one that I tend to use in my classroom and in my office when I'm working with students and teachers, both, but mostly students. For better or worse, all students understand electronics, right? They understand, and they know that if they have a phone or an iPad or something, that when it's down to 10%, it needs to be recharged, right? So I do a battery activity, and I have a battery, and I show them a battery, and I ask them, are you at 5%, 10%, sort of how they can show me. And then sometimes it's even as much as if you're at 100%, do you need to discharge any energy, right? And sometimes it's if you're at 20%, what do you need to recharge, right? So giving them visuals to actually make sense of how they can describe how they're feeling or what they need is really helpful too. And I think that bridges the double empathy problem. It's a double empathy solution, I guess, to some degree, because everybody can understand the need of, I need to recharge. Even if you can't describe why or what you're feeling, it's something that we can all sort of relate to.
Yes. And, piggybacking on the battery analogy is that some things will drain your battery faster than others.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Streaming a movie versus, checking your text messages. And that is true for life as well, depending on, again, the way your brain is organized. There's certain environments and certain things that will drain your battery much more quickly, and you will need to recharge more quickly as well.
And when I talk to teachers, one of the things I talk about is like, think about when you have all these apps open in the background. And even if you're not using them actively, how quickly it drains the battery on your device. We can think about the things in the environment around a student as those apps that you may not think are being used, but they're running in the background, right? So that visual clutter, perhaps, the distractions, the noise, the lights buzzing, like the things that are just there and we don't always think about as actually being used, but they're information that systems are trying to sort through in order to get to that main app. And so that's the piece where you can say, like, there are some things that need to like close down because they're going to drain that battery quicker.
Yes. Words shape culture. And even well-intentioned educators will use deficit-based terms without even realizing the harm, low functioning, special needs, challenging behavior. And neurodiversity affirming language kind of shifts the narrative towards strengths and respect. And I feel like that is changing. And a lot of that is the way a lot of clinicians, a lot of educators were trained. And how can educators and even clinicians audit and shift their language to be truly neurodiversity affirming?
I mean, the first thing you really said it there when you said it's the way we were trained, right? We were all trained with this sort of people first, deficits-based perspective. And I think just acknowledging that we're in a system that actually isn't set up to look at strengths. When we are setting up individualized education programs, we're looking for deficits, right? Like that's how those programs are, that's how students get support often is by identifying their deficits. So I want to be really intentional in saying we're in a system that makes it really hard. And I think that's important because I think we don't want to set people up to say like, this is a main problem, right? But it can be, I can contribute to a solution, right? And so that's the switch I want to make. The first thing that I think is really important is to think about things more neutrally, right? We do a lot of sort of putting subjective opinions, subjective perspectives on behavior, for example, is a really good example. When we talk about behavior, people are like, oh, behavior. There's a behavior. Behavior in itself is not good or bad. It's just behavior. It's an action or a reaction. But the fact that we automatically think of behavior as a bad thing says there's something there that's missing. Like we need to stop and take a moment and go, there's good behavior too. And I don't mean good, like I'm putting quotation marks because I don't love that, right? There's neutral and positive behaviors that we don't talk about as often. And so neutralizing the way we talk about things, I think the ability to describe what you see without making judgment on why it's happening or what it is you think is behind it is the first part in neurodiversity affirming language. And that's hard because we're people, right? Who have reactions and experiences that we bring to the spaces, right? We're not blank slates as parents or as teachers or as clinicians. There are things that, connect to pieces of us or connect to our past or connect, that makes it harder for us to just say, this is what I am seeing in front of me. But I think it's a conscious effort to just be able to say, and I love the idea of being able to say like, I think people are like, well, we just have to move forward. But I think that there's value in taking a pause and saying, I don't like the way I talked about that. How can I go back and fix my language, right? And that takes some humility. And And I say that knowing that like there are plenty of times I don't do it well either, right? Just through and through. I think it's really hard, and you know this too, right? It's hard when we're having conversations as quote unquote experts, because we're putting forth all of this information that sounds fantastic. And then in our own lives, sometimes there are days where we're like, oh, I'm not doing that.
Right.
And so I just want to be really clear in saying these are great ideas, but you're not always going to do it well, but you can always try. And that's the piece. So the neutral language is a huge piece of it. The one I said before around neuronormative is important to me. Emily and I chose very explicitly to use that term in the book as opposed to neurotypical. Because typical has that, like, there is a typical that we are expecting to see. I don't love normative either, but there's not a better phrase. But normative at least looks at the fact that when we are looking at testing, there are standard deviations and norms, right? So it gives it more of a like, there's a reason that we think of this as what we should expect. Whether or not we should expect it is a different question. But at least it takes some sting out of the phrase neurotypical and puts some more like distance between the fact that there's no typical, right? There's no typical. There's no one way to be. But if we're describing things as neuronormative, we're talking about like, well, this is what we would expect based on testing curves and
right. This normative sample, right?
Right, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm really glad you brought up the issue with systems, particularly as it relates to IEPs and 504 plans. I think it's always so hard because, again, you have to prove that a child is struggling and has deficits, using their language, that impact their learning. And at the same time, you want to be able to share the children's strengths and all the things that they bring to the table. But the system makes it so hard because it's almost like if they have strengths, then they don't qualify for services.
Right.
You're in this catch-22 where the system needs you to focus on deficits and remediation rather than building on strengths.
Yeah.
And I think that's the problem with the system. And that's where, all this advocacy, parent advocacy, educator advocacy, clinician advocacy needs to change as well. And I'm hoping that there will be room to build in like a strengths-based IEP and 504 plan.
So interestingly, I have had the absolute privilege to work with Digital Promise's Learner Variability Project on their whole child strengths-based IEP project, which does just that, right? It acknowledges that there are deficits. It acknowledges that there are skills that need to be built, but it also gives us a framework. And it's really, what's really nice about this project is there's a whole guide for teachers and administrators to look at your IEPs through a different lens. So it gives you the opportunity to talk about where the skills need to be built, but it also gives you the opportunity to talk about what does this child do well? Where are their interests? What motivates them, right? And it's really an interesting way of looking at the whole child in order to build a program or plan that's really going to support them. So, I've had the pleasure of thinking about this and hoping to see how we can implement it on a larger level. And part of it's about motivational interviewing, right? How do you get at what really, really interests a kid and excites them? Because if we know the context of an entire, we can't know everything all the time, but if we look beyond just math class, if we look just beyond standardized testing, if we look beyond and we think about what's going on in this entire life of the child, and where are there things that bring them joy? Where are there things that bring them a feeling of accomplishment? Like, I will just say, the one thing I think about often is, you think about like kids who really are great athletes or great musicians or things like that. And when their grade point average drops to a certain point, they can't participate in that. Mm-hmm. I have feelings and opinions about this. If that's what brings a kid to school, that's something we can build on, right? So for me, I don't know. That's a whole other conversation, I think. But I do think there's value in thinking about what brings a child to school. What makes them show up?
Motivation, yes.
Yeah.
Because we want engaged students. We want them to want to participate in the learning process. And so we have to look at what are those things that contribute to that.
Which brings us back to belonging, right? It brings us right back to where we started, is that conversation about what makes them feel like they belong in your school. And it may not be the academics. The academics may be the add-on that they need to be a thriving adult eventually, but it may not be the thing that brings them there in the first place.
Right. Right. And, we talked about awareness, and we talked about really what we've been talking about is the need for action and for taking these practical steps. If a teacher or principal, finishes your book today, what's the first change you'd want them to make tomorrow? If anything, it probably will be different for each teacher.
I think it would be different for each teacher, right?
Yeah.
But the first change is I want them to share it with somebody else, because I don't want them to feel alone in this process. The second change is, one of the things that we put in the book is, and I will share it with you so you can share it with your audience too, is the Neurodiversity-Affirming Teachers Compact of Shared Beliefs, right? Big, long phrase, but it's a series of statements that we can all agree are things that we should hold true in our classroom. And so I think that shared commitment to change is the next thing I would ask, is to say to the other teachers around you or the administrators around you, can we agree that every student should have agency? Can we agree that we should make accommodations available, right? So I think that's the first step. The second thing I would say that teachers can do is find that one thing, right? What is the small change that you can make that's going to start making seismic shifts, right? So don't think about the book or the things in the book as this is the handbook for my classroom for the year. Think about it as, this is going to change the way I think about my classroom. And here's the one thing that I can do this right away, right? What is the one thing you can do right away? And how is that going to lead you to the next thing? And if it's just going to be I'm going to look at the kids in my classroom in new ways, that's huge. That's huge, right? To be able to recognize, I have neurodivergent students in my classroom. What I have heard from a lot of teachers is they're realizing, I have neurodivergent colleagues in my school, right? And that's huge in itself, is to be able to say, how am I showing up for the other people I work with in the ways that they feel like they can belong? Because then we're modeling it for the students across the school too.
Right. Amanda, I cannot thank you enough for speaking with me today. We could probably go on for another hour and a half. And I appreciate all that you do. I'm so glad that you wrote this book. If listeners want to connect with you, want to learn more about your work, we're definitely going to put a link to your book in the show notes. What is the best way for them to connect with you?
Oh my goodness, it's such an interesting question. I mean, I'm on I'll accept X. I'm on all of the social medias. I'm not on X. LinkedIn's a great place. But Emily and I also have neurodiversity-affirming-schools.com, where you can find our combined work. I'm going to make sure that I gave you the right name, because we can give the link. But it gives an opportunity to see the work that we do. We run an educator hub, Neurodiversity University, for educator, staff, or professional learning community. And also just, wherever you can find me, if you have questions, let me know, and I will try to answer them as best I can.
Wonderful. I'll be sure to put links to that in the show notes. Amanda, thank you again for being here, for all that you do. I've absolutely loved this conversation.
It's been great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining us today. If you want to learn more about Amanda or grab a copy of Neurodiversity-Affirming Schools, be sure to check out the show notes. And if you found this conversation helpful, please share it with someone committed to making schools truly inclusive. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.